Welcome back to Sleepless History, the podcast where we explore the quiet corners of the past to help you drift off to the gentle rhythm of centuries gone by. I'm your host, and tonight we are travelling back to the 12th century, to the heart of medieval Europe, to the castles and cathedrals, the dusty mountain passes, and glittering Italian city squares of the High Middle Ages. Tonight's story is one of the most sweeping and dramatic in all of European history. It spans more than 50 years of a single man's life. From his early childhood in the rugged hills of southwestern Germany, to the sun-scorched waters of a river in what is now Turkey. It is the story of Frederick I, known to history by his Italian nickname Barbarossa, which means red beard. Frederick Barbarossa was Holy Roman Emperor from 1155 until his death in 1190. He was, by almost any measure, one of the most capable rulers the medieval world produced. He was a warrior, a diplomat, a politician, and in his own way, a visionary. He dreamed of restoring the glory of ancient Rome. He fought the most powerful pope of the 12th century to a standstill. He built coalitions and broke them. He sieged cities and founded them. He led armies across the Alps, across the plains of Lombardy, through the forests of Germany, and finally, in the last act of his extraordinary life, he put on the cross and marched toward Jerusalem. This is a long story, and we are going to tell it slowly, the way it deserves to be told. So settle in. Find your comfortable position and let the world of the 12th century wash gently over you. If you enjoy this story through history, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel grow and ensures I can continue creating these quiet spaces for you. Chapter 1. The world into which a king was born. To understand Frederick Barbarossa, we must first understand the world he was born into, and that world was, to put it gently, complicated. The Holy Roman Empire in the 12th century was not an empire in the way we might imagine one today. It was not a neatly administered bureaucratic state with clear borders, a standing army, and a professional civil service. It was something far messier, far more fragile, and in many ways far more interesting than that. It was a patchwork, a confederation of German princes, bishops, dukes, counts, and city-states, all loosely bound together under the authority of an elected emperor who claimed, in theory, at least to be the successor of the ancient Roman emperors, the protector of the Christian church, and the temporal head of the civilized world. The name itself tells you something about the tensions built into the institution, Holy Roman Empire. Holy because it claimed a divine mandate, a special relationship with the Christian church, and specifically with the papacy in Rome. Roman because it traced its legitimacy back to the empire of Caesar and Augustus, and more immediately to the coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800. Empire because it aspired to the kind of universal sovereignty that the word empire implied. But in practice, the emperor's power was always contested. It was contested from below by the German princes who had elected him, and who never forgot that they could, in theory, unelect his successor. It was contested from the east and the west by neighbouring kingdoms, and most dramatically, most persistently, and most exhaustingly, it was contested from the south, from Rome by the papacy. The Pope and the Emperor had been locked in an ongoing struggle for supremacy since at least the middle of the 11th century. The great conflict known as the investiture controversy, which was, at its heart, a fight over who had the right to appoint bishops and other church officials, had dominated the political life of Western Europe for decades. The emperor needed loyal bishops to run his government. The Pope needed to control his bishops to maintain the integrity and independence of the church, and these two needs were, structurally, incompatible. The investiture controversy had technically been resolved in 1122 by the Concordat of Worms, a compromise that gave the Pope the right to invest bishops with their spiritual authority, while the emperor retained influence over their temporal lands and duties. But compromises rarely resolve underlying tensions. They simply institutionalize them. And the question of who, ultimately, was supreme in the Christian world, the Pope or the Emperor, remained very much open. This was the world Frederick Barbarossa was born into, sometime around the year 1122. The exact date is not recorded, which is itself a reminder of how different the documentary culture of the 12th century was from our own. We do not know the month. We do not know the day. We do not even know with certainty the year. What we do know is that he was born into one of the most powerful noble families in Germany. Frederick's father was Frederick II, Duke of Swabia, from the Hohenstaufen dynasty, a family that took its name from Staufen Castle in the hills of what is now Baden-Württemberg in southwestern Germany. The Hohenstaufens were ambitious, capable, and politically savvy. They had been building their power base in Swabia for generations, and by the time young Frederick was born, they were one of the two dominant dynasties competing for control of the German kingdom. The other great dynasty was the House of Welf, sometimes spelled Guelph, whose power was concentrated in Saxony and Bavaria, in the north and east of Germany. The rivalry between the Hohenstaufens and the Welfs was not merely political or military, it was personal, dynastic, and deeply entangled with the question of the imperial succession. It was, in short, a rivalry that would shape German history for generations, and that would follow Frederick Barbarossa throughout his life. Frederick's mother was Judith of Bavaria, and here is where the story gets particularly interesting. Judith was a Welf, the daughter of Henry the Black, Duke of Bavaria, and the sister of Henry the Proud, one of the most powerful princes in Germany. This means that young Frederick Barbarossa was, by birth, the living embodiment of the two great rival dynasties. His father was a Hohenstaufen, his mother was a Welf. In his very blood, the feud was supposed to be resolved. It was not resolved, of course. Feuds rarely are, whatever blood may say. But Frederick's dual heritage did give him a unique political position. He was acceptable, at least in theory, to both factions. He could speak to both sides, and in the deeply personal, clan-based politics of 12th century Germany, that was an enormous advantage. We know very little about Frederick's childhood. The sources are thin, the details sparse. We can paint a general picture, the childhood of a noble boy in the 12th century, but we should be honest about how much of that picture is inference rather than documentation. He would have grown up in the household of his father, in the castle at Staufen, or in one of the family's other properties in Swabia. He would have been educated by the church, likely by monks or cathedral clergy, in the basics of Latin, theology, and the liberal arts. He would have been trained in the martial skills expected of a noble riding, sword fighting, the management of weapons and horses and men. And he would have been steeped, from his earliest years, in the culture of feudal obligation, loyalty, honour, and warfare that was the air his class breathed. One detail that does come down to us from his youth, though perhaps with a certain amount of legendary embroidery, is the matter of his appearance. He was, by all accounts, a striking man. He was described by contemporaries as having a strong, athletic build, bright eyes, a ready smile, and most memorably a reddish-blonde beard. It was this beard that gave him his nickname. To the Italians, who encountered him repeatedly and not always pleasantly over the course of his campaigns, he was Barbarossa, the Red Beard. It is a name that has stuck across 9 centuries. Frederick's father, Frederick II of Swabia, died in 1147, when young Frederick was in his mid-20s. This event brought Frederick into his full inheritance as Duke of Swabia and thrust him into the dangerous, fascinating, gladiatorial arena of German high politics at exactly the moment when those politics were approaching one of their most dramatic turning points. The reigning king of Germany and emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at this time was Conrad III, Frederick's uncle on his father's side. Conrad had come to power in 1138, and his reign had been marked by exactly the kind of Hohenstaufen wealth conflict we have already described. Conrad had stripped the great wealth duke Henry, the proud of his duchies of Saxony and Bavaria, which had led to years of civil war and political instability. By the time Frederick inherited Swabia, the wounds of that conflict were still raw. Conrad III was, by most assessments, not a particularly successful king. He was capable enough, but he struggled to impose his authority on the fractious German princes, and he was not helped by the disastrous outcome of his most ambitious foreign venture, which brings us to the first great international event that touched Frederick Barbarossa's life. Chapter 2: The Second Crusade and its Failure. In the year 1145, news reached Western Europe that sent a shockwave through the Christian world. The Crusader county of Edessa, one of the 4 states established by the First Crusade in the Levant, and the oldest and most easterly of them, had fallen to the forces of Imad al-Din Zengi, the powerful Muslim ruler of Mosul and Aleppo. Edessa had been the first great prize of the Crusader movement, captured in 1098 even before Jerusalem itself. Its fall was a catastrophe, both strategically and symbolically. Pope Eugenius III responded by calling for a new crusade, but this was not merely a pope calling for volunteers. The preaching of the Second Crusade was entrusted to one of the most charismatic and persuasive figures of the entire medieval period, Bernard of Clairvaux, the great Cistercian abbot, mystic, theologian, and arguably the most influential churchman in Europe at the time. When Bernard preached, people listened. And when people listened to Bernard, they often did extraordinary things. Bernard of Clairvaux travelled throughout France and Germany in 1146 and 1147, preaching the crusade with electrifying effect. King Louis VII of France and his Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine took the cross at Vézelay on Palm Sunday in 1146 in a ceremony of intense emotional power. The wave of crusading enthusiasm swept across the Rhine into Germany, where it was eventually taken up by King Conrad III himself, despite his initial reluctance. Young Frederick, now the Duke of Swabia in his mid-20s, joined the crusade alongside his uncle Conrad. This was Frederick's first real experience of large-scale military campaigning, and the lessons he learned, though not necessarily the lessons one might hope to learn, would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Second Crusade was, by almost any objective measure, a disaster. Let us trace its arc slowly, because understanding its failure is important for understanding what came after. The crusading armies, the French contingent under Louis VII and the German contingent under Conrad III, travelled separately to the east in 1147. The plan was to march overland through the Byzantine Empire to the Holy Land, which is what the armies of the First Crusade had done, albeit with considerable friction along the way. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos was, at least nominally, an ally of the Crusaders, and he provided them passage through his territory in exchange for promises of good behaviour and the return of any formerly Byzantine lands they might reconquer. Things began to go wrong almost immediately. The German army, which crossed into Byzantine territory in the summer of 1147, suffered from supply problems, from hostility among the local population, and from the ordinary chaos of moving a large medieval army across long distances. Conrad, perhaps impatient, perhaps poorly advised, decided to take an overland route through Anatolia, what is now Turkey, rather than following the slower but safer coastal path. Near the town of Dori-Leon in western Anatolia in October of 1147, Conrad's army was ambushed by the forces of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The battle was a catastrophe. The German army was shattered. Conrad himself was wounded. The survivors struggled back to the Byzantine coast, having accomplished nothing except the destruction of a substantial portion of their own forces. Frederick Barbarossa was present at this disaster. He was, by some accounts, among the military commanders of the German force. We do not have detailed records of his specific actions during the Battle of Dori-Leon, but we know that he survived it, and we can assume that the experience left a mark. Watching a well-armed European army be cut to pieces by mobile Muslim cavalry on unfamiliar terrain was a lesson in the limits of force, the importance of intelligence and preparation, and the dangers of overconfidence. The remaining German forces, including Frederick, eventually joined up with the French army, and the combined crusading force made its way to Jerusalem. There, in the summer of 1148, the leadership of the crusade gathered for a great council to decide on their next move. And here, the Second Crusade reached the height of its strategic incoherence. The most logical target, from a military and strategic standpoint, was Aleppo or Mosul, the territories of the successors of Zengi, who had captured Edessa and who continued to threaten the Crusader states. Instead, the council decided to attack Damascus. This was a deeply counterproductive decision for several reasons. Damascus was at this time under the control of the Burid dynasty, who had generally maintained reasonably cooperative relations with the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. They were not friends, but they were not the immediate enemy either. More importantly, attacking Damascus risked driving that city into the arms of the Zengid dynasty, the very enemy the crusade was supposed to be containing. The siege of Damascus began in July of 1148. The Crusaders initially made good progress, establishing themselves in an orchard zone west of the city that provided both food and cover. But within days, disagreements among the Crusader leadership about who would control Damascus if it fell led to a catastrophic tactical blunder. The army moved to a more exposed position on the eastern side of the city, and when Muslim relief forces began to arrive, the besiegers found themselves unable to continue. The siege of Damascus was abandoned after just 4 days. The crusading force retreated. Conrad III sailed home to Germany in September of 1148 without having achieved anything. The French army lingered somewhat longer, but accomplished no more. The Second Crusade had been a complete failure. Edessa was not recovered. No significant territory was gained. The prestige of the crusading movement was damaged, and the political consequences rippled back into Europe. In Germany, the failure of the crusade was one more weight dragging down the already struggling reputation of Conrad III. For Frederick Barbarossa, however, the experience was formative. He had seen the consequences of poor strategic planning, divided command, and the failure to think clearly about ends and means. He had experienced firsthand the logistical challenges of large-scale military operations, and he had seen what it looked like when a powerful expedition, backed by the full emotional and religious weight of Christendom, came apart because its leaders could not agree or could not adapt. These were lessons he would apply, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, in the decades of his own reign. There is one other dimension of the Second Crusade worth mentioning before we move on, and that is its long aftermath in Germany. When Conrad returned home, he found his kingdom in its familiar state of tension, with the Welf-Hohenstaufen rivalry smouldering and the great German princes forever jockeying for position. He also found himself aging and unwell. Conrad III died in February of 1152, and the question of who would succeed him as King of Germany and Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was immediately and urgently before the German princes. It was at this point that the story of Frederick Barbarossa truly, decisively, and irrevocably began. Chapter 3: The Election and the Rise to Power. On the 4th of March in the year 1152, the German princes gathered at Frankfurt to elect a new king. This was how the Holy Roman Empire worked. The King of Germany was not simply the son of the previous king, though hereditary considerations always played a role. He was elected by the leading princes of the realm, an arrangement that gave those princes enormous leverage, and that made the business of succession perpetually uncertain and frequently dangerous. The two leading candidates were, predictably, representatives of the two great rival houses. On the Welf side, there was Henry the Lion, the powerful Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, one of the most formidable magnates in Germany. On the Hohenstaufen side, there were various candidates connected to the family of the late Conrad III. But the man who emerged from the election as king was neither the obvious choice from either camp. He was Frederick of Swabia, the young, relatively untested duke whose greatest political asset was precisely that he was not purely either Hohenstaufen or Welf. He was, as we have noted, both. The election of Frederick was in many ways an act of collective pragmatism by the German princes. They were tired of the Welf-Hohenstaufen civil war. They wanted a ruler who could bridge the divide, who could bring stability, and who was capable enough to actually govern. Frederick, at around 30 years of age, seemed to offer these qualities. He was energetic, intelligent, martial, personable, and by virtue of his mixed bloodline, he could be presented to both sides as at least partially their own. There is a famous account of the election that has come down to us through the chronicles of the time, though we should treat it, as we treat all such accounts, with a degree of historical skepticism. According to this account, Frederick himself made an eloquent speech at Frankfurt, in which he described his dual heritage and his intention to govern in the interests of the whole realm rather than any single faction. Whether or not he actually delivered such a speech in exactly those terms, the political message was real. Frederick understood his position. He understood what the princes needed from him, and he was prepared to play the role they were casting him in. Frederick was elected King of Germany at Frankfurt on the 4th of March, 1152. He was crowned at Aachen, the traditional coronation city of the German kings, the city of Charlemagne, just a few days later, on the 9th of March. He was, from that moment, Frederick I, King of Germany, King of Italy, and, in anticipation, future Holy Roman Emperor. The imperial coronation, by long tradition, required the involvement of the Pope and had to take place in Rome, but the German coronation was the essential first step. The new king moved quickly and decisively to consolidate his position. One of his first and most significant acts was a grand gesture of reconciliation toward the Welf faction. He met with his cousin, Henry the Lion, the man who might have been king instead of him, and concluded an agreement that would define their relationship for the next 25 years. In exchange for Henry's loyalty and support, Frederick confirmed him in his duchies of Saxony and Bavaria, giving him a territorial power base of extraordinary size and wealth. This arrangement with Henry the Lion was one of the defining political relationships of Frederick's reign. It was, for a long time, mutually beneficial. Henry was a loyal and effective supporter of Frederick's campaigns, particularly in Germany and in the early Italian expeditions. But it also created a subject who was, in terms of raw territorial power, nearly the equal of his king. That imbalance would eventually produce a rupture of catastrophic consequences, but we will come to that in due course. Frederick also moved quickly to address the outstanding conflicts within Germany, travelling extensively through his kingdom in the first months of his reign, holding court, dispensing justice, confirming privileges, and making the personal connections that were essential in an age when rulership was fundamentally a matter of presence and relationship. He was good at this. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as affable and approachable in person, a man who could put people at ease while never allowing them to forget who they were dealing with. He also began making careful preparations for what would be the great ambition of his reign, the restoration of imperial authority in Italy. Italy was, for the Holy Roman Empire, both an enormous temptation and an enormous headache. The Italian peninsula was one of the wealthiest parts of the known world. Its cities Milan, Venice, Genoa, Florence, Pisa, and dozens of others were among the most prosperous trading centres in Europe. Its agricultural lands in the Po Valley were highly productive. Control of northern Italy would give an emperor enormous resources, but Italy was also extraordinarily difficult to control. The cities were increasingly self-governing, proud of their independence, and resistant to imperial authority. The papacy in Rome regarded Italy as its own sphere of influence, and was perpetually suspicious of imperial power there. And the sheer geography of the country the Alps, forming a formidable barrier between Germany and northern Italy, and the peninsula's length making sustained military presence logistically challenging, made the whole enterprise a recipe for difficulty. Several of Frederick's predecessors had attempted to assert imperial authority in Italy with mixed results. Frederick intended to do better. He intended to do it properly, systematically, and lastingly. But first, he needed to secure his position in Germany and he needed to get himself crowned emperor in Rome. These goals were intertwined because a king of Germany could only call himself emperor after receiving the papal coronation, and the papacy in Rome in the 1150s was in an unusually complicated situation. Pope Eugenius III, the man who had called the Second Crusade, had died in 1153. His successor, Anastasius IV, was elderly and died within a year. The pope who was in place when Frederick was making his plans for Rome was Hadrian IV, who is famous in history as the only Englishman ever to sit on the throne of St. Peter. His original name was Nicholas Breakspear, born in Hertfordshire, educated in France, risen through the church to become a cardinal and then pope in 1154. Hadrian IV was a man of considerable ability and considerable stubbornness. He and Frederick were going to have to work out the terms of their relationship very carefully because each of them needed something from the other, and each of them was wary of giving away too much. Frederick needed the papal coronation. Without it, he was technically only king of Germany, not emperor. The imperial title carried a different kind of prestige, a different kind of claim to authority over the Christian world. Hadrian needed Frederick's military support. There was a significant political and religious problem threatening the stability of Rome itself. An influential reformer named Arnold of Brescia had established himself in Rome and was preaching a radical agenda that included the idea that the church should renounce all its temporal wealth and power and return to apostolic poverty. Arnold had won a substantial following among the Roman citizenry who had established a commune and were challenging the Pope's temporal authority over the city. Hadrian wanted Arnold dealt with. He needed a strong military force to restore his authority in Rome. Frederick had that force. The deal was, on the surface, relatively straightforward. Frederick crossed the Alps into Italy in the autumn of 1154 at the head of a substantial army. His first Italian campaign was, in military terms, relatively limited. He was not yet attempting the kind of sweeping assertion of authority he would pursue in later campaigns. He was focused on the specific objective of getting to Rome and securing the imperial coronation. He travelled through northern Italy, and one episode from this journey is worth noting. The city of Tortona had long been in conflict with the neighbouring city of Pavia, which was a loyal supporter of the empire. At the request of the Pavians, and as a demonstration of imperial authority, Frederick besieged and destroyed Tortona in 1155. It was a harsh act, and it gave the cities of northern Italy an early indication of what Frederick's brand of imperial authority might mean in practice. It was noticed and not forgotten. Frederick continued south, met with representatives of Pope Hadrian IV, and the negotiations between them produced an agreement at Sutri in 1155. Frederick agreed to hand over Arnold of Brescia, who was executed by hanging and then burned a brutal end that tells you something about the anxieties Arnold had provoked in the church authorities. In return, Hadrian agreed to crown Frederick emperor. The coronation took place in Rome on the 18th of June, 1155. Pope Hadrian IV placed the imperial crown on Frederick's head in the Basilica of St. Peter, and Frederick Barbarossa became Holy Roman Emperor. The ceremony was followed almost immediately by violence. The Roman populace, which had been associated with the reformist commune and resented the imperial presence, rose in a rebellion that Frederick's troops suppressed with considerable bloodshed. Hundreds were killed or wounded in the fighting in and around the city. It was not an auspicious beginning to the new emperor's relationship with the city that bore the name of his empire. Frederick withdrew from Rome relatively quickly. He had what he had come for the crown, and he had learned something important about the volatility of Italian politics. The march back north through Italy in the summer and autumn of 1155 was eventful. Frederick attempted to hold an imperial diet, a formal assembly of his Italian subjects at Roncaglia, a traditional meeting place near Piacenza in the Po Valley. The Roncallian Fields, as they were called, would become a recurring site for imperial pronouncements about the governance of Italy. But at this first meeting, Frederick's attempt to assert imperial authority was limited in its practical effect. He did not yet have the institutional apparatus or the military presence to enforce his decisions, and he withdrew north to Germany before the autumn was out. Still, the campaign had achieved its primary objective. Frederick Barbarossa was Holy Roman Emperor. He was 33 years old, and the great drama of his reign was only just beginning. Chapter 4. The Italian Wars begin and the Papal Schism. The years following Frederick's return from his first Italian campaign were busy ones in Germany. He consolidated his authority, managed the perpetual tensions among the German princes, and made careful preparations for a return to Italy on a much more ambitious scale. He had tasted the complexity of Italian politics on his first campaign, and he understood that if he was going to genuinely reassert imperial authority over northern Italy, he would need to go back with greater resources, clearer legal instruments, and a more systematic approach. He also made an important dynastic move in 1156. He divorced his first wife, Adela of Vohburg, on grounds that are somewhat obscure in the historical record, and married Beatrice of Burgundy, the daughter of Count Renaud III of Burgundy. Beatrice was only about 12 years old at the time of the marriage, which was entirely conventional by the standards of the period, though it makes us uncomfortable today. The marriage was of enormous political significance, because Beatrice was the heir to the county of Burgundy, which added a substantial and strategically important territory to Frederick's domains. Beatrice would also prove to be an excellent partner in the fullest sense. She accompanied Frederick on his campaigns, participated in political life at court, and bore him a large number of children. By most contemporary accounts, it was a successful marriage. Now, to understand the great confrontation that would consume much of the middle period of Frederick's reign, we need to understand the legal framework he was attempting to build for his Italian dominion. In 1158, Frederick returned to Italy with an army that was, by all accounts, considerably larger and better organized than the force of 1154. He crossed the Alps with a host that contemporaries described as enormous, and he made his way to the Roncallian Fields in November of 1158 for what became known as the Diet of Roncalia. The Diet of Roncalia in 1158 was one of the most significant political events of Frederick's reign. He had brought with him a team of legal scholars from the great law school at Bologna, one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in the world, and at this time a leading centre for the study of Roman law, which was experiencing a major revival throughout Western Europe. These jurist scholars deeply versed in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great compilation of Roman law assembled under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, provided Frederick with a powerful intellectual weapon. Roman law was meticulous, systematic, and extraordinarily detailed in its descriptions of imperial authority. And what it said about the rights of the emperor was, from Frederick's perspective, highly flattering. At the Diet of Roncalia, Frederick promulgated a series of edicts based on the Roman law concept of regalia, the rights belonging exclusively to the sovereign ruler. These regalia included the right to appoint officials in the Italian cities, the right to levy certain taxes, the right to control roads, rivers, harbours, and coinage, and the right to require military service from his Italian subjects. In short, Frederick was claiming the full panoply of imperial rights over northern Italy as defined by the ancient Roman legal tradition. For the cities of northern Italy, which had been effectively self-governing for decades, this was alarming. They had their own elected consuls, their own tax systems, their own militias, their own commercial networks. The idea that an emperor in Germany could suddenly swoop in and claim all these rights for himself, backed by learned lawyers and an army, was not merely an inconvenience. It was an existential threat to everything they had built. The first great target of Frederick's reasserted imperial authority was the city of Milan. Milan was, in the 1150s, the largest and most powerful city in northern Italy. It was wealthy, proud, and had a history of fierce independence. It had been in conflict with its neighbours Pavia, Cremona, Como, Lodi for years, often in ways that embarrassed or challenged imperial authority. Milan was the obvious test case, the city whose submission or defiance would determine the shape of Frederick's Italian project. The conflict between Frederick and Milan had been building since his first campaign. He had received complaints from Milan's neighbours about Milanese aggression, and he had issued summons and demands that Milan largely ignored. Now, backed by his legal framework and his army, he moved against the city. The first siege of Milan in 1162 is actually preceded by years of escalating tension and a series of military campaigns that we should trace carefully, because the back and forth between Frederick and the Lombard cities forms one of the most complex and fascinating military political narratives of the entire medieval period. But first, we need to deal with the papal situation, because beginning in 1159, Frederick found himself embroiled in a religious crisis that would complicate everything else he was trying to do for the next 17 years. When Pope Hadrian IV died in September of 1159, his death triggered one of the most significant and damaging schisms in the history of the medieval Catholic Church. The cardinals who gathered to elect a new pope were deeply divided. A majority elected Roland Bandinelli, who took the name Alexander III. Alexander was a former professor of canon law at Bologna who had served as a cardinal and as chancellor of the Roman Church under Hadrian. He was brilliant, tenacious, deeply learned in the law, and he had a very clear and forceful view of the proper relationship between the papacy and the empire. The papacy was supreme, period. Alexander III had, as a cardinal, been a persistent thorn in Frederick's side during the negotiations of the previous years. There are accounts possibly embellished by later tradition, but historically plausible, of pointed exchanges between Cardinal Roland and the emperor at various meetings, in which the cardinal had challenged imperial pretensions with the kind of intellectual confidence that must have infuriated Frederick. A minority of the cardinals elected a different man, Victor IV, a candidate generally favourable to imperial interests. Victor also took a papal name and claimed the throne of Saint Peter. This was a schism, a situation in which two men simultaneously claimed to be the legitimate pope, each supported by different political factions. Schisms were not unprecedented in the history of the Church, but they were enormously destabilizing. They created confusion about which pope's decisions were legitimate, which bishops and clergy owed their allegiance to which authority, and critically for Frederick, which pope the emperor should recognize. Frederick called a church council at Pavia in February of 1160 to resolve the question. He stacked the council with his own supporters, and, entirely predictably, the council recognized Victor IV as the legitimate pope. Alexander III responded by excommunicating Frederick. The political consequences of this decision were enormous and far-reaching. Most of the kingdoms of Western Europe, France, England, the Scandinavian kingdoms, Sicily recognized Alexander III as the legitimate pope rather than Victor IV. This meant that Frederick found himself in a minority position internationally, with only his immediate German and Italian allies supporting his antipope, and excommunication was not a mere formality. In the 12th century, when religious authority was central to political legitimacy, being excommunicated by a pope, even a pope whose legitimacy was disputed, created real practical difficulties. Frederick's subjects were technically released from their obligations of obedience to him. His allies in other kingdoms were placed in an awkward position, and his ability to call on the moral authority of the Church for his Italian campaigns was severely compromised. The schism dragged on for years, 17 years in fact, and during those years Victor IV died and was replaced by a succession of imperial antipopes, while Alexander III operated from France and later from various Italian cities, building an international coalition of support and doing everything he could to undermine Frederick's position. Meanwhile, Frederick continued his Italian campaigns, and they escalated dramatically in the early 1160s. Let us now turn to the events leading up to the Great Siege of Milan. After the Diet of Roncalia and the beginning of the Schism, Frederick spent several years conducting military operations throughout northern Italy, trying to enforce compliance with his Roncalian edicts and to punish cities that defied him. The resistance, however, was fierce and widespread. The Milanese, in particular, refused to accept imperial officials, expelled Frederick's representatives, and continued to assert their independence. Frederick laid siege to the city of Crema, a Milanese ally, in 1159 to 1160. The siege of Crema was exceptionally brutal, even by the standards of medieval warfare. Frederick used hostages' children, according to some accounts strapped to his siege engines, in the hope that the defenders would refuse to fire on their own people. The Cremonese fired anyway. The city fell and was largely destroyed. In 1161, Frederick besieged and destroyed the city of Milan's close ally, the city of Lodi. He then turned his attention to other Milanese supporters, systematically reducing the network of allies and client cities that gave Milan its strategic depth. The Great Siege of Milan itself came in 1162. By this point, Milan was largely isolated. Many of its traditional allies had been defeated, destroyed, or had submitted to imperial authority. The city was enormous by medieval standards. It was genuinely large, with a population that historians estimate at somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people. It was well fortified. It had a capable military, but it had been fighting for years. It was exhausted, and its supply lines were increasingly compromised. Frederick's army surrounded Milan and began a systematic siege. Unlike some medieval sieges that were essentially blockades, hoping to starve a city into submission over months or years, Frederick combined blockade tactics with active assault, engineering, and psychological pressure. The city held out for a considerable time, but by March of 1162, the situation inside Milan had become untenable. The population was suffering from hunger and disease. The military situation was hopeless. The consuls of Milan made their submission to the emperor. The fall of Milan was followed by one of the most dramatic scenes of Frederick's entire reign. The leading citizens of Milan, consuls, knights, wealthy merchants, came out of the city barefoot, dressed in simple clothes, with ropes around their necks, and prostrated themselves before Frederick to beg his mercy. It was a ritual of total humiliation, of complete submission, of the kind that medieval political theatre demanded for a city that had defied its lord. Frederick accepted the submission, but the punishment he imposed was severe. Milan was not destroyed immediately, that would come a year later. For now, the population was expelled, forced to resettle in 4 separate villages around the city's perimeter. Then, in 1162 and into 1163, Frederick systematically demolished the city. The walls were torn down, the houses levelled, the churches damaged, the great cathedral of Milan partially dismantled. The city that had been the pride of northern Italy was reduced to rubble. It was an act of extraordinary severity that sent a message throughout the Lombard plain. This is what it means to resist the emperor. But the destruction of Milan did not end resistance. If anything, it inflamed it. The cities of northern Italy were appalled. They could see that what had happened to Milan could happen to any of them. And rather than submitting in terror, many of them began to think about a different response. Frederick spent several more years in Italy after the destruction of Milan, conducting further campaigns, holding more diets, appointing more imperial officials. He seemed for a moment to have genuinely succeeded in subordinating northern Italy to imperial control. He held the field. His antipope Victor IV had died in 1164 and been replaced by Paschal III, was grudgingly recognized in his Italian territories. Alexander III was in exile. But underneath the surface, the resistance was organizing. In 1167, the year in which the events we are about to describe took place, Frederick returned to Italy for what would prove to be his most ambitious campaign to date. He brought a large army. He marched south through Lombardy, collecting troops and supplies. His stated objective was Rome itself, to drive out Alexander III, install his antipope Paschal III in the Lateran Palace, and achieve a decisive settlement of the schism on his own terms. He reached Rome and besieged it. The city fell. Frederick captured the Leonine city, the area of Rome on the right bank of the Tiber that includes St. Peter's Basilica and the Castel Sant'Angelo, in July of 1167. Pope Alexander III fled, disguised, some accounts say, as a pilgrim. Paschal III was installed as pope. For a brief moment, Frederick seemed to have achieved total victory, and then catastrophe struck. In the summer heat of the Roman Campagna, epidemic disease, almost certainly malaria, though some sources suggest other diseases as well, erupted with devastating effect in Frederick's army. Men began dying in enormous numbers. According to the chronicles, more than 2,000 of Frederick's knights and nobles perished in the space of a few weeks. The death toll among the ordinary soldiers was certainly far higher. Several of Frederick's closest companions and most important commanders died. Frederick himself fell ill, though he survived, but his army was shattered. He had no choice but to withdraw northward. His triumphant campaign turned to catastrophe by microscopic enemies that no sword could touch. And while Frederick's army was dying of disease, the cities of northern Italy made their move. The Lombard League was formally established in December of 1167, though its roots lay in an earlier defensive alliance dating to 1164. The League was, in concept, a defensive mutual aid organisation of the cities of Lombardy, Milan, which was being rebuilt after its destruction, Bergamo, Brescia, Mantua, Verona, Vicenza, Padua, and others. They pooled their military resources, agreed to support each other against imperial aggression, and most provocatively of all, they began to rebuild Milan, the city Frederick had ordered destroyed, as a symbol of their defiance. The League also named a new city, founded on the Po Plain south of Milan, after Pope Alexander III himself. They called it Alessandria in Italian, that is, Alessandria and its very existence was a direct challenge to everything Frederick had tried to achieve. Frederick was temporarily unable to respond to this challenge because the situation in Germany was deteriorating. His absence on repeated Italian campaigns had allowed tensions among the German princes to build, and he needed to return home to manage them. He crossed back over the Alps, leaving behind him an Italy that had, to a significant degree, slipped from his grasp. The years from 1168 to 1174 were largely spent in Germany, where Frederick worked to consolidate his position, manage the continuing schism, and prepare for what he knew would have to be another major Italian campaign. He also worked on his relationship with Henry the Lion, the great Welf duke whose loyalty and military support would be essential for any further action in Italy. These were years of significant domestic achievement. Frederick held a great feast and ceremony at Mainz in 1164 to canonize Charlemagne as a saint, a political religious act that served to link the Hohenstaufen dynasty with the Carolingian tradition and to reinforce the imperial ideology Frederick was building. He also continued to develop the administrative and legal frameworks of his German kingdom. But the great unresolved crisis of his reign, the Italian situation, and the Papal Schism could not be put off indefinitely. A reckoning was coming. Chapter 5. The Battle of Legnano and the Peace of Constance. In 1174, Frederick Barbarossa returned to Italy for the 5th time. He crossed the Alps in the autumn with what contemporary sources suggest was a fairly modest force compared to his earlier campaigns. The great nobles and princes of Germany were increasingly reluctant to commit their resources to Italian adventures that seemed to produce little lasting benefit. Henry the Lion, in particular, declined to participate. This refusal, or at best, half-hearted participation by the most powerful magnate in Germany, would have profound consequences. Frederick nonetheless pressed forward. He spent the winter of 1174 to 1175 in the Po Valley, conducting operations against the Lombard League cities. He besieged the new city of Alessandria, the city named after his enemy, Alexander III, for several months in the winter and spring of 1174 to 1175. The siege was a long, grinding, difficult affair. The city was well built and well defended, its citizens fiercely motivated. Frederick tried every approach he could think of: direct assault, mining under the walls, blockade. None of them succeeded. There is a famous story, probably embellished in the retelling, but rooted in some actual event, about the siege of Alessandria. According to this account, Frederick's troops tunnelled under the city walls, intending to pack the tunnel with combustible material and collapse a section of the fortifications. The citizens of Alessandria reportedly discovered the tunnel, and rather than simply blocking it, they drove a donkey into it. When Frederick's engineers set the tunnel alight, the sound of the donkey braying in the smoke and confusion reportedly caused the besieging soldiers to believe that the mine had failed, leading to a premature and chaotic assault that accomplished nothing except casualties. Whether or not the donkey story is literally true, it captures something of the frustration and difficulty of the siege. Frederick eventually abandoned the siege of Alessandria in the spring of 1175 and concluded a truce with the Lombard League at Montebello. The terms were essentially a pause. Neither side formally surrendered anything, but both sides stepped back from active military operations. Frederick returned to Germany. In Germany, the great crisis with Henry the Lion was approaching. Henry had, for the entirety of his career as Frederick's most powerful vassal, used the emperor's frequent absences on Italian campaigns to extend his own power and influence in northern Germany. He had conquered new territories, had quarrelled with the Archbishop of Cologne and other powerful churchmen, and had generally behaved in ways that made him enemies, even among the German princes who were not natural Hohenstaufen allies. The exact sequence of events that led to Henry the Lion's downfall is complex and disputed in the historical sources. What we know is that by 1178 and 1179, a coalition of German princes was bringing formal complaints against Henry to the imperial court. They accused him of a variety of offences against the peace of the realm, of failing to answer summons to appear before the imperial court, and crucially of having failed to provide the military support he owed to the emperor. That last charge was connected to the Italian campaigns. When Frederick had needed Henry's troops, and Henry had withheld them, Frederick had suffered military setbacks. The failure at Alessandria, in particular, was attributed by many contemporaries to the absence of Henry's forces. Whether or not this was entirely fair, military campaigns fail for many reasons. It was politically damaging to Henry. Frederick, who had protected Henry for decades and had gone out of his way to maintain the relationship, finally concluded that he could no longer shield his cousin from the consequences of his behaviour. The legal process against Henry the Lion ground forward, and in 1180, Frederick presided over a judgment that stripped Henry of all his lands and titles and condemned him to exile from Germany for 7 years. It was a dramatic end to one of the most important political partnerships of Frederick's reign. Henry the Lion left Germany and went into exile at the court of his father-in-law, King Henry II of England. He would eventually return to Germany, but never to his former power. But let us return to Italy, because the decisive military confrontation of Frederick's Italian policy was approaching. After the truce of Montebello expired, Frederick resumed his Italian campaign in 1176. He crossed the Alps in the spring of that year, intending to link up with a fresh force of German troops that was making its way south through the Alps separately. He had his Italian forces, his imperial officers, and his own personal household troops, but he needed reinforcements before he could take on the Lombard League in open battle. The situation was further complicated by the fact that he was trying to intercept and connect with his relief column somewhere in the territory of the city of Como, while Lombard League forces were actively trying to prevent exactly this junction. On the 29th of May, 1176, near the town of Legnano in Lombardy, about 25 kilometers northwest of Milan, Frederick's cavalry force encountered the army of the Lombard League. The Battle of Legnano is one of the most studied battles of the medieval period, not only because of its dramatic outcome, but because of its broader historical significance. Let us describe it as carefully as the sources allow. The Lombard League army had several notable features that distinguished it from a typical medieval force. While the League did have mounted knights, its core military formation was the infantry of the Lombard cities, particularly the citizens' militia of Milan and its allies. At the centre of the Lombard line was a carroccio, a war wagon bearing the banner of Milan and the cross of the city's patron, St. Ambrose. The carroccio was both a practical rallying point and a symbol of civic identity, a way of bringing the values and pride of the city itself onto the battlefield. Frederick's cavalry, acting with the aggression characteristic of imperial forces throughout the Italian campaigns, charged the Lombard position. The initial charge was ferocious. The Lombard cavalry was driven back or scattered. For a moment, it seemed as if the imperial forces might carry the day, but the Lombard infantry held. The carroccio did not waver. The foot soldiers of Milan and its allied cities, the same people who had rebuilt their city from rubble after Frederick's destruction, who had named their new city after the Pope who was Frederick's enemy, who had been fighting imperial control for 2 decades, stood their ground and absorbed the cavalry charge. And then the Lombard cavalry, which had been scattered in the initial melee, rallied and returned to the battlefield. They struck Frederick's troops from the flank and rear. The imperial force, which had extended itself in the pursuit of the initial charge, was suddenly surrounded. The result was a complete rout of the imperial force. Frederick's banner was captured, his horse was killed. Frederick himself, according to some accounts, was thrown or dismounted in the chaos of the defeat, and for a period of time, no one at the imperial court knew whether he was alive or dead. His wife, Empress Beatrice, was reportedly in a state of profound grief, believing him slain, before news arrived that he had survived and was making his way back through the chaos. The Battle of Legnano was a shattering defeat for Frederick. It was not merely a military setback, it was the collapse of the entire strategic foundation of his Italian policy. His army was destroyed. His prestige was badly damaged. His ability to continue military operations in Italy was essentially gone for the foreseeable future. Legnano is often cited by historians as one of the most significant battles of the medieval period, not because of its immediate military consequences alone, but because of what it demonstrated. It showed that the infantry of self-governing city-states, fighting with civic motivation on familiar ground, could defeat the heavy cavalry of a medieval empire. It was, in a sense, a preview of a pattern that would repeat itself across European history, the slow, grinding challenge of determined civic and national identities to the authority of universal empires. For Frederick, the lesson was clear. He could not conquer the Lombard cities by force. He had tried repeatedly over more than 2 decades, and the result had been the destruction of Milan, which had been rebuilt, a series of exhausting campaigns, enormous expense in money and men, international isolation because of the Papal Schism, and now a catastrophic military defeat. It was time for a different approach. The peace negotiations that followed Legnano were long and complex, involving not only Frederick and the Lombard League, but also Pope Alexander III, who was in a position of considerable strength. Alexander had outlasted not only Victor IV, but a succession of Frederick's antipopes, and he had done so by building a broad international coalition of support and by using the legal and moral weapons of the papacy with considerable skill. The first major step was a personal reconciliation between Frederick and Alexander III, which took place in Venice in July of 1177. This meeting, sometimes called the Peace of Venice, though the full peace with the Lombard League was not concluded until later, was one of the most dramatic moments of Frederick's reign. The scene, as described by contemporaries and embellished by later tradition, has Frederick prostrating himself before Alexander in the piazza, before the Basilica of St. Mark in Venice. The emperor, one of the most powerful men in the world, lying face down before the Pope he had been fighting for 17 years. Alexander raising him up, the two men embracing. How much of this description is literally accurate, and how much is the kind of theatrical elaboration that medieval chroniclers love to apply to great scenes of reconciliation is difficult to say. But the essential facts are not in dispute. Frederick and Alexander met in Venice in July of 1177. The schism was formally ended. Frederick acknowledged Alexander as the legitimate pope, and the two men reached a modus vivendi. The anti-popes there had been 4 of them over 17 years, were eventually reconciled to the church, and the damage of the long schism was gradually repaired. The reconciliation with Alexander was followed by a 6-year truce with the Lombard League, during which negotiations continued toward a lasting peace. That peace was finally concluded in 1183 at Constance, in what is known as the Peace of Constance. The Peace of Constance was, in broad terms, a compromise that conceded more to the Lombard cities than Frederick would have wished, but less than might be expected given his defeat at Legnano. The cities retained the right to elect their own consuls, their own government. They retained control of their own internal affairs. Frederick's regalia, his imperial rights, were acknowledged, in theory, but significantly limited in practice. He kept his overall sovereignty, his honorific supremacy, but he gave up most of the practical mechanisms of control he had tried to assert at the Diet of Roncalia. It was, in sum, a recognition of reality. The Lombard cities were not going to be governed as subjects of a distant emperor in the way that Frederick had attempted. They were too wealthy, too populous, too politically developed, and too stubbornly committed to their own independence. What Frederick got from the Peace of Constance was peace, stability, and crucially, the recognition of his nominal supremacy and the revenue that came with it. It was not the triumph he had dreamed of. It was not the restored Roman Empire, but it was a sustainable arrangement, and it freed Frederick to turn his attention to the remaining years of his reign. He was by now in his early 60s, an advanced age for the 12th century. His wife Beatrice had died in 1184, and Frederick had lost a deeply important personal and political partner. But he remained active, capable, and engaged with the affairs of his empire. The last great chapter of his life was beginning. Chapter 6. The Making of an Emperor, Germany, Culture and Legacy at Mid-Reign. Before we reach the final act of Frederick Barbarossa's life, the Third Crusade, it is worth pausing here, in the relative calm of the early 1180s, to take stock of the man and the civilization he represented. Frederick Barbarossa was, at this point in his life, in his early 60s, and he had been ruling as king and emperor for over 30 years. What had he actually achieved? What did his reign look like from the inside, from the perspective of the people who lived within it, who attended his court, who fought his wars and managed his empire? The first thing to understand is that Frederick's court was not merely a political institution. It was a cultural one. The 12th century was a period of extraordinary intellectual and artistic vitality in Europe, sometimes called the 12th century Renaissance, a flowering of Latin literature, philosophy, theology, and the arts that prepared the ground for the high medieval culture of the 13th century. Frederick's court participated in this broader cultural movement. It attracted scholars, poets, and clerics of considerable talent. The historiography of the reign is rich. We have detailed chronicles written by men close to Frederick, including the brilliant Otto of Freising, who was Frederick's uncle on his mother's side, and who wrote both a universal history and a detailed chronicle of Frederick's early reign, and Otto's continuation by Rehuin, which covers the first decade of the Italian campaigns. These are serious works of historical writing, sophisticated in their interpretation and remarkable in their detail. Frederick also cultivated a strong sense of the imperial idea, the idea that the Holy Roman Emperor was the successor of the ancient Roman emperors and the legitimate heir to their authority. This idea was expressed in ceremonial, in the language of imperial documents, in the architectural ambitions of his court, and in the political theology that his court scholars developed. He was not merely a German king, he was the ruler of the Christian world, the temporal counterpart to the spiritual authority of the Pope. This imperial ideology was not simply personal vanity, though Frederick certainly had a healthy regard for his own dignity and prestige. It was a serious political claim that had real consequences. It justified his campaigns in Italy. It supported his ability to call the princes of Europe to account. It gave his authority a universal dimension that went beyond mere territorial sovereignty. Frederick was also, in a more prosaic sense, a capable administrator. He was one of the first German rulers to develop something approaching a consistent system for managing the royal lands and resources. He worked with a permanent staff of clerical administrators who handled the growing paperwork of royal government. He used the royal charter, the formal written document confirming rights, grants, and decisions more systematically than most of his predecessors. He was building, slowly and imperfectly, the administrative foundations of a more durable state. His German kingdom, while still deeply feudal and fragmented, was more coherent and better governed at the end of his reign than it had been at the beginning. He had managed the great noble families and their perpetual tendency toward private war and territorial aggrandizement with a combination of force, conciliation, and legal process that, while imperfect, kept the realm broadly functional. The downfall of Henry the Lion had shown that even the most powerful magnate was not immune to the emperor's justice. We should also say something about Frederick, the man, in his personal relationships, insofar as the sources allow. He was, by all accounts, genuinely devoted to his wife Beatrice, and her death in 1184 seems to have affected him deeply. He had a large number of children. The exact number is somewhat uncertain, but by Beatrice he had at least 10 who survived infancy, including his successor, Henry VI. He appears to have been an engaged and caring father by the standards of his time and class, participating in the arrangement of his children's marriages and their political futures with real attention. He had a gift for personal loyalty that inspired intense devotion among the men who served him closely. The chronicles of his reign written by men who knew him describe him with genuine affection, not merely the formal praise that courtly historiography required. Otto of Freising, his uncle, who was a sophisticated and honest enough writer to be critical when criticism was warranted, describes Frederick with evident admiration. Rahiwin continues this tradition. He was also, it should be said, capable of considerable brutality. The destruction of Milan, the siege of Cramer with its hostage atrocities, the punishment of cities that defied him, these were not aberrations in his record, but expressions of a medieval military culture that operated on different moral assumptions than our own. The point of exemplary brutality was precisely to deter further resistance. Whether it actually worked in the long run is another question, but Frederick was operating within a recognized tradition of medieval warfare, not outside it. Now, let us speak about the religious life of the man, because this matters enormously for understanding what he did in the last years of his life. Frederick Barbarossa was, by the standards of his time and class, a conventionally devout Christian. This is not meant dismissively. Conventional 12th century aristocratic Christian piety was a serious thing. It included regular attendance at the liturgy, generous patronage of monasteries and churches, genuine belief in the spiritual significance of holy sites and relics, and a real, felt sense of obligation toward the defense of the Christian community. Frederick had supported the papacy against his own interests, when his own interests did not override that support. He had been a crusader in his youth, participating in the disastrous Second Crusade. He had, in the long conflict with Alexander III, genuinely believed, or at least genuinely argued, that he was acting in the interests of the Church as well as the Empire. The Papal Schism was, from his perspective, a legitimate dispute about which candidate was the rightful pope, not a rejection of the papacy as an institution. When he finally reconciled with Alexander III in Venice, he did so not as a man crushed against his will, but as a man who recognized the pragmatic and spiritual necessity of ending a division that had damaged everyone. There is, in the accounts of the Venice meeting, something that reads as genuine relief, as well as political calculation. This religious dimension of Frederick's character is essential context for understanding the Crusade. Before we move into the Third Crusade, let us take just a moment to appreciate the world as it stood in the late 1180s. Frederick Barbarossa was in his mid-60s. He had reigned as emperor for over 30 years. He had made peace with the Lombard cities. He had reconciled with the papacy. Henry the Lion was in exile. Germany was, by the standards of the era, relatively stable. His son Henry was being groomed as his successor and was already showing considerable administrative and political ability. The empire, if not what Frederick had dreamed of making it, was in a better state than it had been when he inherited it. It was a remarkable achievement for a man who had spent so much of his reign fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. But the news arriving from the east in 1187 was devastating to the Christian world, and it would set Frederick on the final road of his life. Chapter 7. The Fall of Jerusalem and the Call to Crusade. On the 4th of July, in 1187, at the Horns of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee, in what is now northern Israel, one of the most consequential battles in medieval history took place. The forces of Saladin Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the most capable Muslim military commander of the 12th century, met the combined army of the Crusader states of the Levant and destroyed it utterly. King Guy of Jerusalem was captured. The true cross, the relic believed to be a fragment of the cross on which Jesus had been crucified, the most sacred object in Christendom, the battle standard of the Crusader kingdom, was taken. The military strength of the Crusader states was essentially annihilated in a single afternoon. Saladin had spent years carefully preparing this campaign. He had united the Muslim powers of the region under his own leadership, had worked to isolate the Crusader states diplomatically, and had then provoked the confrontation at Hattin with the deliberate intention of destroying the Crusader field army in exactly the conditions: heat, thirst, tactically compromised ground where his own forces had the greatest advantage. The aftermath of Hattin was a cascade of territorial loss. City after city fell to Saladin's advancing armies: Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, Sidon, Beirut. And then, on the 2nd of October of 1187, Jerusalem itself, the holy city, the holiest site in Christendom, the city that the First Crusade had captured in 1199 at such enormous cost of blood and effort, fell to Saladin after a brief siege. Saladin's treatment of the captured city was, by the standards of his time, remarkably restrained. He negotiated a surrender with the Latin Patriarch and allowed the Christian population to ransom themselves and depart. There was no massacre, no mass enslavement. Saladin, as a ruler, was complex and sophisticated, and he understood that treating the captured population brutally would have political costs. But for the Christian world, the fall of Jerusalem was a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible emotional and spiritual magnitude. Jerusalem was not just a city. It was the centre of the Christian understanding of sacred geography, the place where Christ had died, where he had been buried, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stood over the most sacred ground in the world. To have that city in Muslim hands was, for medieval Christians, an offence to God and a rebuke to Christendom. Pope Gregory VIII issued a crusading bull, Audita Tremendi, in October of 1187. The fall of Jerusalem was presented as a divine punishment for the sins of the Crusader population and of Christendom more broadly, and the appropriate response was both penance and military action. The Pope called for a new crusade. The response was remarkable. 3 of the most powerful rulers in Western Europe took the cross: Frederick Barbarossa in Germany, Philip II of France. Richard I of England, the man history would call Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lionheart. The joint response of these 3 rulers represented an extraordinary concentration of military power. Each of them was a formidable commander. Each of them ruled a kingdom with significant resources. Together, they might have been expected to constitute an irresistible force. In practice, as we shall see, it was not quite that simple. Frederick Barbarossa took the cross at a great imperial diet at Mainz in March of 1188. The ceremony, by all accounts, was one of the most emotionally charged events of his long reign. Thousands of German knights, nobles and soldiers took the crusading vow alongside their emperor. Contemporary estimates of the size of the army Frederick assembled vary wildly, as medieval estimates usually do, but it was unquestionably one of the largest forces Germany had ever put in the field. Some sources give numbers in the tens of thousands, even accounting for the inevitable exaggeration of medieval chroniclers. This was an army of very substantial size. The preparations for the campaign were thorough and methodical, characteristic of Frederick at his best. He spent months arranging the logistics of the march, negotiating with the rulers through whose territory he would pass, and putting the affairs of Germany in order before his departure. He was 66 years old, and he must have been aware that this was likely to be his last great military enterprise. He appointed his son Henry, already associated in the governance of the empire, as regent for Germany. He settled outstanding disputes among the German nobles. He organized the supply system for the army and arranged financial provisions for the campaign. He was, in this preparation, the experienced, capable administrator who had managed the most powerful state in Christendom for 35 years. The army set out in May of 1189. The route Frederick chose was the overland route through the Balkans, through the Byzantine Empire, and then through Anatolia, what is now Turkey, to the Levant. This was the same general route that had been used by previous crusades, including the disastrous Second Crusade in which Frederick had participated as a young man. He knew the challenges of this route, but sailing was both expensive and logistically complex for a land force of this size, and the overland route offered more opportunity for resupply as the army moved. The march through the Balkans was relatively straightforward, though not without friction. The local populations were not always welcoming, and the sheer size of Frederick's army made it almost impossible to prevent some looting and disorder, which in turn provoked hostile responses. But Frederick maintained discipline as best he could and pushed the army forward. The real complications began when the army reached Byzantine territory, the Empire of Constantinople. The Byzantine emperor in 1189 was Isaac II Angelos, a man who had come to power in 1185 after overthrowing and blinding his predecessor Andronikos, the first Komnenos. Isaac was a capable enough administrator, but was navigating a very difficult diplomatic situation. On one hand, the German army passing through his territory was an enormous potential threat. A host of crusaders was historically bad news for Byzantine stability. On the other hand, the crusade was aimed at Saladin, with whom Isaac had a certain amount of diplomatic entanglement. Isaac slowed Frederick's march. He delayed in providing the ships that had been promised for ferrying the army across the Bosphorus. His officials were obstructive. There were reports that Isaac had actually concluded an alliance with Saladin, and that he was actively working to hamper the crusade. Frederick's response was characteristically direct. He occupied the important Byzantine city of Philippopolis, the modern city of Plovdiv in Bulgaria, in the autumn of 1189. He threatened much more serious military action against the Byzantine Empire if Isaac did not provide the promised assistance. He opened diplomatic channels with the Serbs and Bulgarians, who were restive subjects of Byzantium, implying that he might support their independence movements if Isaac continued to obstruct him. Isaac eventually capitulated and provided the transportation across the Bosphorus. Frederick's army crossed into Asia Minor into Anatolia in March of 1190. the most difficult and dangerous part of the journey was ahead. The route through Anatolia was controlled by the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the same power whose cavalry had destroyed Conrad III's crusading army at Dorylaeon in 1147. Frederick had not forgotten that disaster. He was marching through territory where a previous crusading force had been annihilated, with an army that, while large, was operating far from its supply bases, and in an environment that favoured the mobile tactics of the Turks over the heavy cavalry of the Germans. The Sultan of the Sultanate of Rum at this time was Kilij Arslan II, but real power was increasingly in the hands of his sons, who were contending for the succession and who adopted varying policies toward the Crusaders. Some of them were prepared to negotiate, others were hostile, and the Seljuk state could field significant forces that could harass and ambush the Crusaders on the march. The advance through Anatolia was grueling. The army faced constant harassment by Turkish cavalry, who avoided pitched battle but struck at the flanks and rear of the column, cut off foragers and stragglers, and disrupted supply. Food and water were scarce. The terrain was harsh. Men and horses died from a combination of combat, disease, heat, and exhaustion. Frederick's army pushed through nonetheless. On the 18th of May, 1190, the crusading force fought and won an engagement at Iconium, the modern city of Konya, the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. Frederick's son, Frederick of Swabia, led the main assault on the city, while the emperor himself defeated the main Seljuk field army outside the walls. It was a significant victory, perhaps the greatest military success of the entire Third Crusade from the German perspective. Iconium was taken and briefly occupied. The Crusaders rested, resupplied, and then resumed their march. Frederick was pushing southeast toward the Cilician Gates. The great mountain passed through the Taurus Mountains that led down to the coast of what is now southern Turkey, the region known in medieval times as Armenian Cilicia, where the Armenian Christian kingdom of Cilicia was a potential ally and resupply point. The army was making progress. Jerusalem was, relatively speaking, not that far away. And then, on the 10th of June, 1190, somewhere along the Salef River, the ancient Kalykadnos, flowing through a gorge in the mountains of what is now the Mersin province of Turkey, Frederick Barbarossa died. The manner of his death is one of the enduring historical puzzles of the 12th century, partly because the sources disagree about the specifics, and partly because the death of a great historical figure in apparently random, almost anticlimactic circumstances tends to generate legend and speculation. The most widely cited account is that Frederick was crossing the Salef River, either swimming across or fording it with his horse, and was swept away by the current. He drowned. The Holy Roman Emperor, the man who had crossed the Alps more times than we can count, who had survived the epidemic that killed thousands of his men outside Rome, who had survived the Battle of Legnano, who had been fighting and campaigning for 40 years, was killed by a river. Some sources suggest he was not swimming, but riding through a shallow ford that proved less shallow than it appeared. Some suggest he was unhorsed and drowned in his armour. Some suggest a heart attack or stroke while in the water, which is plausible given his age and the physical demands of the campaign. One source says he was attempting to cross the river on a bridge that collapsed. The details vary. The outcome does not. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, was 67 or 68 years old when he died. He had been emperor for 35 years. The effect on his army was immediate and catastrophic. The loss of their commander, the man who had organized the campaign, who embodied its purpose, who provided the moral and military center around which the entire enterprise was organized, was devastating. The German crusading force, which had come so far and achieved so much, essentially dissolved. Some soldiers turned back toward Germany. Others attempted to continue but lacked cohesion. A significant portion of the army took ship from the ports of Cilicia and made their way to Acre, but as a fraction of the great force that had left Mainz the previous year. Frederick's body was treated in the manner typical of the time it was boiled to separate the flesh from the bones, a practice that seems ghastly to modern sensibilities, but was a standard method for dealing with the remains of important people who died far from their home territories. The bones were to be carried to Jerusalem for burial in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. His flesh was buried at Tarsus in Cilicia. His internal organs were buried at Antioch. But the bones never reached Jerusalem. Jerusalem was, for most of the next 100 years, in Muslim hands. The bones of Frederick Barbarossa were lost somewhere along the way, and their final resting place is not known with certainty. The Third Crusade continued without him, of course. Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France arrived at the siege of Acre in the summer of 1191, and the siege was eventually successful. Richard went on to conduct a remarkable military campaign that, while it failed to recapture Jerusalem, did secure the coastal cities and negotiated a peace that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites. It was a partial success, more than the Second Crusade had achieved, but far short of what the First had accomplished. But Frederick Barbarossa was not there to see any of it. He was gone, lost in the waters of a river in the mountains of Anatolia, and with him went something of the dream that had driven him for his entire adult life. Chapter 8. The Legacy of Frederick Barbarossa. In the months and years after Frederick's death, his empire passed to his son Henry VI, who proved to be an even more aggressive and capable ruler in some respects. Though his reign was shorter, he died in 1197 at the age of 32. The Hohenstaufen dynasty continued for another half-century, producing the extraordinary Frederick II, sometimes called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, who in many ways surpassed even his grandfather in the scope of his ambitions and the complexity of his legacy. But our concern here is with what Frederick Barbarossa specifically left behind. First, the empire. Frederick had not succeeded in the dream of restoring the absolute imperial authority of ancient Rome over Italy and the German lands. The Peace of Constance had acknowledged the practical independence of the Lombard cities. The German princes had grown in power during his reign, not diminished. The tension between the emperor and the papacy remained structurally unresolved, even if the specific confrontation with Alexander III had ended. And yet the empire Frederick left was, in important ways, stronger and more coherent than the one he had inherited. He had demonstrated that the emperor could impose his will in Germany when necessary. The fate of Henry the Lion was proof of that. He had maintained the territorial integrity of the empire and extended it through the addition of Burgundy. He had put German royal administration on a somewhat firmer administrative footing. He had, through his long reign, given the empire a period of relative stability that allowed economic growth and cultural development. He had also established the ideology of Hohenstaufen imperial rule, the idea of the emperor as the legitimate Roman emperor, the universal temporal sovereign of Christendom, in a more developed and articulated form than any of his predecessors. This ideology was not ultimately successful in the medieval period. The papacy and the Italian cities, and eventually the German princes, combined to ensure that the universal empire remained an aspiration rather than a reality. But the articulation of that idea, the serious intellectual work that went into it, influenced political thought for centuries. His relationship with the papacy is one of the most important dimensions of his legacy. The 17-year schism with Alexander III was, in many ways, a test case for the question of whether the Pope or the Emperor would be supreme in the Christian world. The answer, by the time of Venice in 1177, was neither, or rather both, within their respective spheres. The Emperor was sovereign in temporal matters, the Pope in spiritual ones, but the boundary between those spheres was genuinely unclear and genuinely contested, and the practical resolution was always a matter of negotiation and balance of power, rather than clear principle. Frederick's reconciliation with Alexander set a precedent for future Pope-Emperor relations. It demonstrated that even the most bitter and protracted conflict between the two powers could be resolved through negotiation, that neither side was strong enough to permanently destroy the other, and that some form of coexistence was necessary even when genuine cooperation was impossible. The Battle of Legnano deserves a special note in Frederick's legacy because its significance extended far beyond the specific military conflict between Frederick and the Lombard League. The battle became, over the centuries that followed, a powerful symbol of civic resistance to tyranny, of the rights of self-governing communities against imperial power, of the capacity of ordinary citizens to defend their freedom against professional military forces. In Italian political thought, particularly from the 19th century onward, Legnano became a founding myth of Italian civic identity and national consciousness. The Lombard League was reimagined as the ancestor of Italian nationhood. Frederick Barbarossa became, in this narrative, the archetype of the foreign oppressor. This 19th century reimagining had its own political purposes and distorted the reality of the 12th century in various ways. The Lombard cities were not a proto-Italian nation. They were fierce rivals to each other as well as opponents of Frederick. Their alliance was tactical and temporary, not the expression of a national identity that would not begin to form for many centuries. Frederick was not simply a tyrant, but a ruler operating within the legitimate frameworks of his time. But the symbolic use of Legnano tells us something important about how historical events outlive their original context and take on new meanings in new eras. The legend of Barbarossa in German tradition deserves a note as well. In German folklore, there developed a tradition attested from at least the 13th century that Frederick Barbarossa had not truly died. Instead, he slept beneath the Kyffhäuser mountain in Thuringia, Germany, in an enchanted slumber, his red beard continuing to grow and curling around the stone table at which he sat. He would awaken, the legend said, when Germany needed him most, when the ravens stopped flying around the mountain, and he would emerge to restore the German Empire to its former glory. This is one of the classic expressions of the returning hero myth, the same archetype that appears in Welsh tradition with King Arthur sleeping under a hill, in various other European folk traditions. The specific application to Barbarossa tells us something about how deeply he had impressed himself on the German imagination. He was not just a historical figure, but an ideal of strength, of justice, of imperial greatness. In the 19th century, during the movement for German unification, this legend took on new political significance. Nationalist writers and artists invoked the sleeping Barbarossa as a symbol of German unity and imperial ambition. The great monument at the Kyffhäuser Mountain, completed in 1896, features both Frederick Barbarossa sleeping in the lower level and Kaiser Wilhelm I, the first emperor of the unified German Empire, on horseback at the top, implying a direct spiritual and political continuity between the medieval empire and the modern one. This appropriation of Barbarossa's image by German nationalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries is, like the Italian appropriation of Legnano, a fascinating example of how historical figures are continually remade by the present. The real Frederick was a 12th century ruler who operated within 12th century political and cultural frameworks. He was not a German nationalist. He was not fighting for Germany in any modern sense. His wars were dynastic and ideological, centered on the idea of universal imperial authority, not national sovereignty. But symbols have lives of their own, and the name Barbarossa, the Red Beard, has accumulated meanings over the centuries that the man himself could not have imagined. There is one more use of the name worth mentioning. In June of 1941, the Nazi regime launched its invasion of the Soviet Union under the code name Operation Barbarossa. The choice of name was deliberate, an invocation of medieval German imperial ambition, of conquest in the East, of the image of an unstoppable German military force. The operation was, of course, ultimately catastrophic for Germany and for millions of people. The real Barbarossa's memory was, in this way, pressed into the service of one of the most destructive enterprises in human history. It is a reminder that historical memory is never neutral. How we remember the past shapes what we do in the present. And figures like Frederick Barbarossa complex, powerful, admired, and feared in equal measure, are perpetually available for reimagining according to the needs and anxieties of each new era. What, then, can we say about the actual man? Frederick Barbarossa was, by the standards of any era, a remarkable human being. He was intelligent, capable, resilient, and possessed of extraordinary energy. He reigned for 38 years over the most complex political entity in the medieval world, managing simultaneous challenges in Germany, Italy, and eventually on crusade in the East, with a competence that few of his predecessors or successors matched. He was also a man of his time capable of cruelty, limited by the political and moral frameworks of the 12th century, pursuing goals that we might judge harshly from our perspective, but that were entirely coherent within his own. He believed in the divine mandate of the emperor. He believed in the crusade. He believed in the duty of a lord to his people and the duty of his people to him. He acted on those beliefs consistently and with conviction. His Italian policy, for all its eventual failures, produced some of the most significant constitutional history of the medieval period. The Lombard League and its victory at Legnano shaped the development of the self-governing Italian communes in ways that would eventually lead, through many twists and turns, to the extraordinary cultural flowering of the Italian Renaissance. The Peace of Constance, which gave the Lombard cities formal recognition of their autonomy, was a landmark in the development of municipal law and self-government. His German administration, while far less developed than modern state structures, laid groundwork that his successors built upon. The Hohenstaufen legacy, for all its eventual collapse in the crisis of the mid-13th century, contributed significantly to the legal and administrative vocabulary of medieval government. And his crusade, the magnificent, disastrous march across the Balkans and Anatolia, ended so abruptly in the waters of the Salif, is one of the great could-have-beens of medieval history. If Frederick had survived the crossing of that river, if that vast German army had arrived at Acre or at the gates of Jerusalem, the Third Crusade might have looked very different. History, of course, does not run on hypotheticals. But the sheer nearness of the moment the army was across the worst of Anatolia, the victory at Iconium had been won, the coast was within reach, makes the accidental quality of his death particularly striking. There is something in keeping with the man's life that he died in the attempt. Frederick Barbarossa spent his entire adult life in motion, crossing mountains, besieging cities, marching through heat and cold, managing armies and courts and political negotiations with restless, inexhaustible energy. He died not in bed, not in his castle, not surrounded by the comforts of an old age earned, but in a river, in armour, on campaign, still pressing forward toward the holy city that had driven Christian Europe to extraordinary and sometimes terrible efforts for nearly a century before his birth. He was, to the end, the emperor, the red-bearded, tireless, visionary, stubborn, brilliant, flawed, and extraordinary emperor who had shaped the 12th century more than almost any other single individual. The rivers of Anatolia took him, but 9 centuries later, his name is still spoken, his story is still told. And somewhere under the Kyffhäuser mountain, in the imagination of the German folk tradition, he sleeps on waiting for the ravens to fall silent, waiting for the moment when the world will need him again. And there we are, dear listeners of Sleepless History. We have travelled 9 centuries tonight, from the snow-covered hills of Swabia to the courts of Rome and Venice, from the siege lines before Milan to the mountain passes of Anatolia. We have watched a man rise from a contested election to the height of medieval power, and we have watched him march, fearlessly and with absolute conviction, toward a death he almost certainly did not see coming. I hope the story of Frederick Barbarossa has given you something to rest your mind on tonight, something vast and distant enough to loosen the grip of the present, to remind you that human beings have been dreaming, striving, building, and failing on this earth for a very long time. The 12th century is far away now. The Holy Roman Empire is gone. The Lombard League dissolved. The crusading movement has long since ended, but the stories remain. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with Sleepless History. Whether you made it all the way to the end or drifted off somewhere around the Diet of Roncalia, I hope you found what you were looking for: a few hours of quiet, a little history, and the comfort of knowing that the world is old and enduring, and that tomorrow will come regardless.